son's a senior in high school, and so I really wanted to make as many of his soccer games as I could. So that pinched things as well. And anyway, I'll get out there for sure. And, yeah.
We will be here.
Okay, great.
All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Books in Common Northwest this evening for our event with Chris Dombrowski and Nickolas Butler. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Books in Common Northwest, which we're bringing back for this special event tonight, is a virtual event series presented by my store, Paulina Springs Books, as well as Country Bookshelf in Bozeman and Madison Books in Seattle. Before I properly introduce our guests this evening, I just wanted to go over a couple housekeeping items. If you're having any technical difficulties, we recommend just exiting and re-entering the Zoom session. If that doesn't work, this event is also being live streamed on the Books in Common Northwest YouTube page, which is also where you can find a recording of this event and all of our past events after this event concludes. If you have any audio issues, we recommend first plugging in some headphones, as that usually does the trick. A reminder also that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that everyone in attendance be respectful of other attendees. Any offensive behavior or questions will result in being kicked out of the session. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your own questions and vote on other questions that you'd most like to hear answers to. And we'll get to as many of those as time allows. And with all of that out of the way, I'm pleased to introduce our guests for the evening and then pass things off to them. Chris Dombrowski is the author of Body of Water, A Sage, a Seeker, and the World's Most Elusive Fish, and of 3 acclaimed collections of poems. Currently the assistant director of the creative writing program at the University of Montana. He lives with his family in Missoula, and his newest book is The River You Touch. Nickolas Butler is the internationally best-selling author of the novel Shotgun Love Songs, The Hearts of Men, and Little Faith, and the story collection Beneath the Bonfire. Butler is the recipient of multiple literary prizes and commendations and has published articles, reviews, short stories, and poetry in publications such as Plowshares, Narrative, and the New York Times Book Review, among others. He lives with his wife and 2 children on 16 acres of land in rural Wisconsin. Without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to our guests, and I'll be back later in the evening to field some questions from the audience. Welcome, Chris and Nick, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lane. And thanks to everybody who is attending this virtually. Thanks for not tuning in the Bears game tonight. Chris, it's really good to see you, man. I wish we were out in Montana together hunting, but this will have to do for now. How are you?
For now, it will have to do, Nick. That's great to see you too. Yes, I was thinking that this is a far second to sharing a meal at the table after chasing the bird dog around the hills, but we'll make that happen in the next month or two.
I hope so.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I mean, let's get right into it. I was going to have you read right off the start, but then actually I realized I have like a comment that I think maybe you can just sort of riff on, and that was that one pleasure that I had reading your book the first time and then rereading it when it was finally finished in finished hardcover was that the obvious revelation that you, my friend, have lived a really beautiful life, and that comes through in this book. And the book is fun, and it's invigorating, and it's inspiring. And I just wonder, like, now that you've finished the second nonfiction book, you've got like five or six books under your belt. Like, how are you processing your life? Because it looks pretty good from here. It feels like everything is really, really beautiful. Like you've lived a vigorous life. How are things going?
Well,
how do you survey it?
I don't survey it. Is the truth. I mean, it's sweet of you to say that, and I do think that if you look at the book, it is maybe a chronicle of a life well lived, right? But also maybe a chronicle too of how difficult it can be to try to live such a life.
Sure.
That I remember driving years ago with my buddy Jeff Foucault, who's also a Wisconsin boy, and we were driving from Livingston to over toward Melrose, Montana, to fish the Big Hole River, and we were looking out at this guy in the middle of an alfalfa field who was moving his irrigation pipe, and we were kind of jokingly equating our lives as artists with that rancher. Like, yeah, it's the good life, but it takes a hell of a lot of work to live it, But boy, I mean, in terms of the writing and the work, like I can't believe my fortune, to have this book coming out with a press that I admire, and to have support from friends like you and writers I admire. I said this, like I was opening up the box of books, that first box of hardcovers that comes in, and
yeah,
I stopped myself because I was like hurrying through it. We had just returned from a trip, and I was like opening it up real quick, and I stopped myself and I said, wait a second. Don't ever forget how good this feels and how exciting it is to open up a box of your books. Like the amount of work that goes into it from you reading the first draft several years ago, on through the editors and the copy editors and the blurbists and the all of that stuff. Like there's just so much effort that it takes to put a book into the world, that I stopped myself and said, slow down, because this is a moment that you want to relish every time you get to do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that that kind of rolls us into another question, maybe a slightly darker question, but it gets at some of the things you were talking about. The first time I read this book, I definitely recognized it as, like sort of like the arc of your career as a writer and as a fishing guide, and also as a husband and a dad. But one thing that I couldn't put my finger on exactly was that I think it's a book in some ways about mental health. Which is interesting, because you look at the cover, you look at the title. I mean, you might just assume that it's a fishing book or a nature book or something like that. But the more that I went back into it, I think after your drafting and also just like a lot of timely conversations that I'm having with other friends in my life who are artists, this is so we talked about the beauty of a life well lived and hard won, but there's the darker side of it too. You want to talk a little bit about that angle?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I do talk about it. I think there were parts of this book that were really, really difficult for me to unearth, and those had to do very much so with my mental health. Ultimately, one of the old subtitles for this book that we did away with was learning the language of rivers. Ultimately, it seemed a little too esoteric, but I actually think that deep down it's very true to the core of the book. Our mutual buddy John Larison, folks out there in Oregon probably know his work very well. Whiskey When We're Dry is his novel that everyone knows. John had read an early draft too, and he said something to me like, I'm so glad to know that you came through what you came through, and that the voices of the natural world were louder than the ones in your head, you know?
Yeah.
And I love that because it's true. And ultimately that notion of, I mean, learning the language of rivers is a bit much, but listening to them and knowing that there's a language outside of us, or it is inside of us as well. You know, it's absolutely of a piece, but learning to listen to those other languages that are occurring outside of our own messy heads, I think is at least at the core of the philosophical truth of the book, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and of course Larison would just put his finger on that nicely. Reminds me of like Galvin saying something that like deep souls tend to find each other, and I'm not surprised that you two have found each other so nicely. So man, as you said, I read an early draft of this book and I loved it. I wasn't surprised that I loved it, but you did a hell of a lot of work with the drafting. Like, this finished book is phenomenal, and on a molecular level, on a word by word level, a sentence by sentence level, it is fucking gorgeous. Talk to me about like the experience of drafting it, and is drafting something that you enjoy? I hate drafting. I just kind of want to nail it the first time around. But looking at your process from start to finish, man, I mean, this is like a masterclass in drafting and getting it just right.
Man, I wish I were faster than I am. I'm just not, you know. I'm not like you. I think you do that Harrison thing of you know, rolling around for years with a character or a voice or a plot in your head, you know, and then when you sit down, it just all spills out. I mean, partially for me, I'm still shaking off the trappings of being a poet, you know, and so just navigating the world of sentences is always I don't know, it's a different world. But I was watching a buddy of mine the other day who's a painter, and he had this cool time-lapse video of a fish that he had painted. His name's George Hill. He's a beautiful painter. He's has a bunch of shows all over Montana, and we go way back to Michigan days. Anyway, he had this time-lapse video of this trout that he was painting, and it was going to be about about the size of the painting behind me on the wall, maybe 36 by 24 or something like that. And you know, the paint started out and there's kind of an oval like shape, and then over time you could see that was going to be the face, the mouth, and the jaws of a trout, and then you could see it was going to be a brown trout, and then you could see it was going to be a male brown trout with that beautiful like opalescent hue of blue on the cheek, and so on and so forth. And then finally there was this like lovely varnish that he put on at the end. And I realized while watching him, that's my process of writing prose. You know, I start out with a shape that's not very recognizable, and then I recognize it as a chapter perhaps, and then I start to put in the detail, and eventually what I hope is the varnish, you know, or the pearl buttons on the shirt, as you and I often say. And so, yeah, I mean, I wish I were faster, but also thematically with this book, there was so much going on. You know, if you remember, you helped me with titles, often with your kind silence. You know, I would send you a title and you'd go, I don't know. But the one that we were bouncing around that I actually think you liked was All of It Everywhere. Do you remember that
I did
one?
like that.
And ultimately, I just thought like it was a little too true. Like there is so much in this book that's going on in terms of themes, the landscape, navigating the wilderness of parenthood, overcoming depression, making a life in the West that's becoming more and more difficult to make a life in. And then like the more philosophical themes of time and interconnectedness and interpenetration is the lovely word that Gary Snyder uses. And so I can't remember where I was going with that, but yeah, the title was the final. The River You Touch was the final kind of shifting in the drafting process where it all kind of came clear to me. And that title actually comes from a Da Vinci quote. In rivers, the water that you touch is the last of what is past and the first of that which comes. So with present time. And I thought, okay, that title does it for me. I wanted something that was tangible. And I wanted there to be, I've said this a couple of times in recent interviews. I think at this point in this century and moment of mania was Robert Penn Warren's line in another century that was equally maniacal. He said, that was his phrase, the century and moment of mania. And from my perspective right now, the only thing that really can transform us is direct contact with the actual physical world. We're so screwed otherwise. We're manipulated. We're mistrustful. We're rightly mistrustful. We're manipulated. And the only thing that can really transform us is this notion of direct contact. And I wanted the prose to enact that as much as possible. It's of course a far-fetched idea and perhaps fanciful, but I wanted the prose to be as deep a sensory experience as possible. So it took a while.
The prose is spectacular. And it was so funny. I was working on something like a chapter for a future project last night, and I wrote in my little Word document the word glassine, and then I looked at, I was like, I don't even know if that's a word, and I just did like a quick Google search, and I couldn't actually find anything. And then I was spending some time with your book the other day, and today I was like, son of a bitch, there's glassine right there. No, the prose, man, is so beautiful, and like our mutual hero Harrison, I feel like another wonderful thing about this book is that you just feel like you're in communion with so many different spirits, writers of the past, writers of the present. I think like Harrison definitely revered certain literary voices or artistic voices, and that spirit carries through into your book too. This book is so rich. It's so much more than just about rivers or a guy making his life as a guide. It's so rich. And so you brought up a couple things in that last string of consciousness comments, and one of them that I was thinking about is sort of a darker question maybe, but you kind of touched on it a little bit. And you and I have talked about this in letters and when we're out hunting together, but Montana, like a lot of places in America, is changing. Montana might be changing faster than almost any other part in America. And I wonder how you process that. This book is like a document of, the last 20, 25 years of your life, moving out to Montana, moving to a very different Montana than what exists now. And, you use the word often to describe yourself and your family, like feral. I think about you, this guy, you're sort of like a you're sort of like a bird dog yourself. You might live in the city, but that maybe isn't really where you belong. You belong in the field or on the river. And how are you dealing with these changes, and how do you feel about it? Like, how is it changing your ability to be that feral oarsman, to be that fucking cool guy out on the river and in the fields hunting? Like,
That's a great question. I feel like it happened almost exponentially. I mean, it being the new influx of population, the new influx of money. Of course, it never happens overnight. But I'm an optimist, and so for years I thought, oh, it will go away, or it'll change, or and then suddenly it was like, oh no, it's coming. And strangely enough, one of the moments of real epiphany for me was reading an early draft of Godspeed, your novel, right? I was reading it in galleys, and I thought to myself, oh man, this isn't a prophecy. This isn't a cautionary tale. It's a document of what has been happening, right? I mean, obscene amount of money coming in, altering the way people can do business, altering their ability to make a living in a place, that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to get into that without going down a totally dark road at this point, but
we can back off that dark road.
No, I think that Rick Bass and I have talked about it a little bit. We've said, would it be worth we joked, would it be worth our time to raise a bunch of money, and then everyone who comes into the state, we can just give them a welcome packet that says, all right, this is how we do it here. Don't mess it up. So, and that, that would include everything from like, you wave at people when you're driving down the road to, I got honked at the other day when I was letting a person cross the street, a pedestrian cross the street on foot. And I said, don't judge. But if you turn around and their license plate is from Texas, you can stick your middle finger out the window or whatever. And sure enough, it was. And I didn't. I kept my hand in the car, but I thought to myself, there is a different generation of people who are moving here. And this is a generalization, of course, which is, to quote Czesław Miłosz, the true enemy of man. But when I moved here, when people like me moved here, we came in search of a lifestyle. And the people who were kind of showing us that lifestyle, we looked to them for advice and, for example, right? And there's some idealization in that comment, and there's the ignoring of colonialism in that comment. But what I mean is that, like, I came here looking for a way of life, and I knew that people who had already established themselves here in inventive sorts of ways, could maybe show me that. But I don't see a whole lot of that going on right now. I see basically like new money coming in and trying to turn the West into, I don't know, Seattle, San Francisco, which is, there's a lot of shittiness in that,
Yeah. Shut my door. You can come down. Shut the door. I got kids. I got dogs.
That's okay.
I'm single parenting tonight, Dombrowski. So, one thing that I love so much about this book, it's one of the most like heartfelt and heartbreaking threads of the book in the best possible way is, and I don't think you set out to do this. I can't believe you set out to do it when you started, but I think you must be very glad that you did when you finished. And that's just the notion of like community. You know, can you talk a little bit about how community came to become such a big part of this book? Because I think you, if I had to bet, I think you started to tell your life story and you wanted to talk about being a guide and you wanted to talk about discovering the West and you wanted to talk about the differences between the Midwest outdoors experiences and then how the West sort of saved your life. I don't think you really set out to talk about your newfound friends, your clients, your doctor who's saving your life because you don't have great insurance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and it actually ties a little bit back with what you were talking about with regard to Harrison and those, the voices that he allowed in, he was fond of quoting people all the time.
Yeah,
and I
as
thought,
are you, by the way. I was thinking about it.
Yes,
I don't have anybody else in my life who has such a deep well of memory for brilliant quotes. You are always quoting.
All that starts out with baseball cards, man. You and I were both baseball card people, and there you go. Lance Parrish, of course. There he is. Catcher for the 84 Tigers, World Series winners. But yeah, I don't know where I get that. I think I might be a little messed up in the brain because there's a lot of things I can remember that are useful in the classroom and are not very useful elsewhere in life. But this notion of community, I think you're absolutely right, was something that I stumbled on within the form of the book. Chiefly, I thought to myself, because it's just the way I am, everyone is more interesting than me, and so I would rather tell the story of the Dr. Phil who, treats people for free. He actually was over, was it last night? No, it was 2 nights ago. Our son Luca had gotten elbowed in a soccer match, and Phil was over resetting his nose for free on the couch. It was a beautiful moment.
By the way,
anyhow,
this might be a book about the American West, but there is nothing more Midwestern than saying that everybody else in the world is more interesting than you. So
it's just born and bred into us, right? But yeah, when so an early reader of the book said to me, I like what this does. I like what this book does as a Western, in the sense that, like, the old Western was man goes out, solitary man goes out, conquers nature, right? Scales the mountain, kills the whatever. But this is way more the story of a community kind of helping a person, me, through different trials. And in that sense, like, the whole power of the community is given voice. And so, like I said, it started out as simply like a question of interest and whose story I would rather tell. And it developed into a theme, which is, the power of community and how we are, we're redeemable if we become part of a community, because we're, we're more vulnerable that way. We're more, how do I say it?
And more valuable.
Implicated.
Yeah. Valuable to a community.
Yeah.
Many of these fantastic and interesting relationships that you recount in this book, Chris, a lot of it comes down to the fact that you're, I think I can say this right. You're one of the most famous fishing guides in your part of the world, right? You are excellent at what you do, and people want to be with you. People want to spend time with you. They want to learn how to fish. They want to learn rivers through you. So you might not be able to see yourself all that time, or you might get more out of it than you think they're getting, but.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think I joke about this in Body of Water, right? Famous fishing guide is a triumphant oxymoron, right?
Sure. I get it.
And but the thing about guiding is you always go back to square one. Like whether someone wants to be with you or not, whether they're excited to be with you or not, you're always at the mercy of the river, right? Because as soon as they go 10 minutes without a fish biting their fly, they forget who's at the oars.
I'm sure that's true.
So, but
yeah,
I think that's that's probably part of that too. As a storyteller, that I sat in the middle for so long, in between two people who were telling stories often back and forth to one another, that I just naturally kind of became a conduit for those stories like Pegs in the book,
right,
and so on. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
One thing
famous mean I can raise.
Does famous what?
Mean I can raise my prices?
Yeah, absolutely. Not with me.
Okay.
But with everybody else. with all this new Montana money.
Yeah.
I wrote this. I just so you know that I could have faked my way through this interview, but I was sweating things. I was preparing. So this next question is a whole page long. I apologize to the people that are tuning in there if I sound a little wooden while I'm reading this, but I want to get it right. One thing I loved about this book is that your wonderful and beautiful and infinitely patient wife, Mary, is featured throughout. Not like a side note or a footnote, but fully and roundly portrayed. And I know how much you adore Mary and your children, but I wondered what your thought process was as you really portray your family on such a molecular and emotional level. I'm not sure that it's like a risk in the conventional, like literary sense, but it is in a way, isn't it? Because I mean, like, what happens if you get something wrong about your wife? What if you expose too much or too little? And it also got me thinking about, probably writers that you and I both hold in high esteem, somebody like Ed Abbey, who's out, in Utah. And all we ever saw of Ed was just him in the desert, but what was left out were his many lady friends or whoever else was supporting him. You are definitely not doing that. You're giving us, the full domestic Monty, changing diapers and the times when you're sick and Mary is not, she's like, fine, you're going to make it. So, I mean, was that a risk for you? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it was. I mean, I've gotten this question a few times and I haven't answered it well yet. In fact, the other night, Mary was listening to me do an event like this, and she said, I heard your answer. She said, that's all she said. And I asked her, like, well,
all she said was, I heard your answer.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, she's amazing. She's incredible. She's literally, she's my first reader, of course. And so she read this whole book early on. And it was a very, very nerve-wracking time for me. I think she read it while you were reading it, basically, in the early draft. And I thought to myself, if she doesn't like it, or if she doesn't like her portrayal of it, of her in the book,
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to either start over or turn this into a novel, because
By the way, changing it into a novel doesn't really that won't help you.
All right, yeah, that's good. Touche. Yes, I mean, she said basically you have to write this book, you have to write it, and she, I mean, I think fortunately in real life she is the kind of heroine of our family, and so it wasn't very difficult to portray her that way, in the book. And so that was important. But also I thought to myself, as a Western, I kept looking around, and the most interesting and inspiring people that I knew in my community were women, women like Lori, who's the hunter in the neighborhood and fills our freezers with elk, and women like Mary, who's an incredible teacher, like one of the world's greatest teachers, and women like Peg, who kind of anchor this long family of anglers, and so on and so forth. And I thought to myself, like, why not put those women at the forefront of this story, and so there's that. And also, one of the chief themes in the book, I think, is vulnerability, right? I mean, the river is a metaphor in so many ways, and it's often been said that the softest thing can overcome even the most hard. And if you look at a huge boulder on the Blackfoot River, and it has, like, I'm talking about a boulder the size of your desk that has scooped out of the top a small little bowl sized impression or depression, right? I mean, that bowl has been carved out by eons of water moving around and around in a circle, and tossing little grains of sand or pebbles or whatever. And to touch it, water is soft. It's the softest thing. It rolls right off of your hand, right? But over time, and so, like, that notion of vulnerability and of softness, having a sense of power was something that I saw in her life, and I wanted to try to, to capture it. And I think for the most part, I mean, she loves the book, and
That's good.
And she'd be happier with my answer tonight than she was the other day.
Okay. Well, what about the kids, and what about, I guess I'm going to ask this in two separate ways. I mean, like, the reason why I went and found my 1987 Lance Parrish card was because in the book you mentioned that you'd wished your dad was Lance Parrish, and I was thinking no, man, your dad did. I mean, this now. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but, like, no, your dad did a remarkable job. You're such a wonderful. I've been in your house. I've been a guest in your house, and you're a wonderful dad. You're super dialed into your kids, and your wife, and your dog, and your neighborhood. So what is it that makes a good dad? Because this is a book about fatherhood and your children too. And then, one of the other potential risks, I guess, that I was thinking about is, like, your kids are going to read this book, and they're going to be exposed to the reality that you were kind of a fearful dad coming into it, and and they're certainly going to be exposed to all your fragilities. You know, I would think that that would be cool as a kid to be let in on that stuff. But you want to talk about those things? I didn't give you like a super clear question to respond to. I apologize, but
no question. I mean, Luca read it, so he's 18. He read it this summer. Actually, he read The Gallery. We were over in Italy, which was a beautiful, beautiful thing. We were in Italy, and he was homesick for Montana, and he was reading a book about that his dad had written about being homesick for Montana, you know. And I don't know, that's a magical thing that had happened. But I think an interviewer asked me this, like, similar question, like, are you afraid of them seeing you in moments of like brokenness or aloneness, right? And I think no, I'm not, because I think there's an honesty to it, and there's an honesty that comes with confronting those demons, right? And there's ultimately, I think there's like.
Sorry, can I stop you? Was your dad open with you guys, sensitive and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways he was. But in a different way. I mean, my dad was, like you said, I mean, he was such a remarkable human being to have come through, you know, having been emotionally and probably physically abused as a kid. You know, his father was a pretty bad alcoholic. And then to have basically like shed that burden and kind of reconstituted his own path. So I think, but part of this, I think, gets, not to get too theoretical here, but part of, I think, being a good dad walks in concert with like being a good steward of the land, right? To do that, we have to recognize how we've screwed up before. We have to look that, you know, those periods of time in the eye, whether it comes down to like looking our colonialism in the eye, and, you know, our genocide in the eye. Like, we can't pretend that none of that happened, right? If we're going to exist in the West right now. It's preposterous to think that we can do that. And so for me, the exercise was somewhat similar. Like, in a way, there was kind of this examination of the patriarchal failings, right? And so I don't know, I wasn't necessarily thinking about all that when I developed the narrative, but as I went along, it did occur to me that okay, yeah, the kids are going to read this, especially Lily, the youngest, you know. And so I cast the narrative back on really the original concept of the book, which was the early title was The Nature of Wonder, you know. And I wanted to go and examine the idea that wonder, the ability to be awestruck, is endangered right now in our society. And without it, we will very likely lose the impulse to protect the things that sustain us. And it was my kids, my children, that who reawakened in me that sense of wonder. And so ultimately, as you see in the closing passages of the book, it's the children who resurrect me, right? Who gave me. I love what what the writer Lisa Wells, author of Believers, said. She said that the children speak in beguiling riddles, and they're often, I think, whether we know it or not, they're whether they know it or not, they're hearkening us back to a mindfulness. And maybe I'll should I close with a little passage?
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, this will. So I'll preface this just a little, and I think it speaks to exactly what I was talking about. So it's been a rough go. We're returning from Michigan, where I'd taken a job that I thought was going to be my dream job, but actually was almost the downfall of me. And when I was there, I was gifted by a visit from my friend Deborah Magpie Erling, who wrote the beautiful novel Perma Red, and also has a great novel coming out called The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. And Deborah had been at this reading, and she said to me, or she said to the audience, I bet you're glad to have Chris here. We sure miss him back in Montana. And then she turned to me and she said, but not only that, the land misses him. The land itself misses him. And I thought to myself, actually, I didn't think to myself. My mind was completely blown. I'd never even encountered such a notion. And her speaking those words, speaking of community being, the salvation of sorts in this book, I began to ponder those words. I had been guiding on the rivers years at that point, but it never occurred to me that I had established a relationship, with the landscape. And Deborah, it meant, a great deal, as Deborah's an elder in the Salish tribe, and her great grandfather was Chief Charlo. And so to have someone like that who has such an intense relationship with the landscape speak those words to me was it blew me away. So here I am. I'm picking morels with Lily, who's just, I think she's about 2.5 at this point. And I refer a little bit to that passage. We return. There's a hawk moth in our bathtub, still alive, wings fluttering, leaving a frail coat of iridescent scales against the porcelain when we finally arrive in Missoula. A feast of elk prepared by friends, accompanied by countless bottles and toasts with wild roses floating on wine. On our first Blackfoot float, a bald eagle soaring over the river drops a recently captured brown trout into the water. The freshly dead fish arriving moments later downstream at my feet, and hours later, stuffed with onions, potatoes, lemon, and dill atop our hot grill. I want to tell you of these happenings, this week of welcomings, but first to look for morels with Lils. She kneels next to a fallen cottonwood, setting keen, earth-round, earth-reflecting eyes on a drove of morels, a stash viewable only to the prostrate. Psst, Dada, she says, I'm finding everything I see. Walking on, inspired by her attentiveness, I turn Lily's words over in my mind as I would a koan. Though I've picked this cottonwood bottom for longer than Luca's been alive and know the aimless drainage well, every encounter here seems an initial one, my senses not so much noticing as capturing or being captured by the earth's inhabitants. I ruminate for a while on my friend Deborah's words about the land having missed me. How could we ever know if the land is communicating with us? Either it's a far-fetched and fanciful idea, or it is rote, and that the land is always communicating with us, and we're simply ill-attuned to its frequency. Plum blossom, with slight hints of chokecherry lofting on the June air. I hear you. scent of leaks loosed by our footfalls, wafting up from wet earth. Speak my wild name. Tiny white bloom of false Solomon seal, flaring out from undergrowth. Toward your voice I incline. Charged with her rapt attention, I begin to catalog our surroundings. I show Lily a wild strawberry that will soon fruit, the violet splash of a flower, its viney tendrils. On the drying hills, early bear grass and camas, balsam root already beginning to parch. I show her the bed of a cow elk in a fen, a grouse, a vireo, a common yellowthroat, a yellow warbler, a tanager, swallows, geese, a nest of peeping owlets. I list it all. What one could eat, where one lost in the woods, what one should avoid. But the longer my litany gets, the more my gesture feels false. After all, what else have she and her siblings provided me, if not survival instructions, their spirit of wonder and rapturous curiosity sustaining me through the deepest of discordances? You can't pick morels again for the first time, but you can watch a child picking them for the first time. The mushrooms, blonde reflections, blooming in the window-wide eyes of the free ones who free the rest of us.
That's great, man.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this fantastic book and all your books. It's been my pleasure to be here tonight.
Oh, man, thank you. Thanks for stewarding this book into the world. I mean, you were one of the first readers, and you gave me faith in the project. Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about the next one. We're out here in a few months.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, or a few weeks, I should say. Do we have any questions? Is Lane coming back on? I forget what we were doing here.
Yeah, I came. So I can field if anybody in the audience has any questions. We do have a couple more minutes, 5 to 10 more minutes to do some questions from the audience. So you can either drop those questions into the chat or into the Q&A section. Nick, you did such a good job with your questions. You kind of stole most of the ones that I had prepared as sort of filler for the end here. But I did have one that I wanted to dig a little deeper into. You kind of touched on this, but you said something that I thought was really interesting, that we become redeemable if we become part of a community. And I know in the preface to the book, you kind of talk about this in a sentence of sort of this idea, even just of like ethical existence. Like, how can you, you know, you are, by using these things that you proclaim to love, i.e. river, nature, whatever, it's near impossible to truly leave those places better than you found them, right? Like, you just inherently are doing some sort of damage somehow. And I was wondering if that, you know, that idea of being redeemable through community is either tied to that sort of like ethical existence, or just, you know, I just think that that's a really fascinating idea of redemption through community, kind of. And if either of you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think when we become part of community, we become generational, right? We touch the past, we touch the future, which goes back to the kind of the title of the book, right? When we're touching a river, we're basically touching the moment that came before and the moment that comes after. And so by recognizing oneself as part of a community, we recognize ourselves as implicated in the whole milieu, right? And I think we also then recognize ourselves as salvageable too, by that same token, by that same dynamic, you know. Yeah, it's complicated, right? I mean, we're not living in the, what's the Robert Wrigley line, the hallucination of innocence, right? That we come out to the West, and this wide open canvas, with nothing on it anymore. That was an illusion to begin with, a hallucination, as he says. But anyway, yeah, that's a great question. I hope I got that answer for you.
Yeah, totally. Nick, do you have any thoughts to add?
Well, it wasn't going to be an original thought, but one of my best friends here in the Chippewa Valley of Wisconsin, a guy named Bill Hogseth, who's a community organizer, has a quote from Gary Schneider on his refrigerator, which is basically the hope for America is that people stay in their neighborhoods, in their hometowns. Essentially, that if we're always moving around, nobody's invested in anything, and nobody has that generational memory, and there's nothing to fight for. It's one of the reasons why I'm pleased to hear that, Luca Dombrowski's homesick from Montana. It's one of the reasons why we live in Eau Claire, because my wife's family has been here for 5 generations or something like that. There's just things that about your community when you're entrenched in that way that that make it less attractive to shit on the place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You're a steward of that land and the nature and the people around it. And I agree with everything that's been said. And I think that's a great thought to kind of wrap up on. I do have to say, Chris, I'm a huge fan of your writing. For those who haven't, highly encourage you to check it out. And the poetry, the book is The River You Touch, and you can get it from bookshop.org. We've also got some links in the chat here, or just from your local indie bookstore. Nick, I've read Shotgun Love Songs. I haven't read any of your newer ones, but also extremely talented writer who we're lucky to have join us this evening. So encourage everybody to check out his books as well. Either of you all have any last thoughts to add?
I love this idea of ending on community. I love what Nick's friend says. I'm thinking about I'm thinking back to Nick's question about community and how I ended up writing about certain members of the community. And I want to say too that I think one of the books that inspired me to do so was Shotgun Love Songs. It's such a beautiful book about friendship and about, community and what we really, what we can value, can being the operative word there. If we choose to, what's the old Kittredge quote? What has announced itself as invaluable, and so much of what we encounter in the West, I think, if you ask the right people, qualifies as that. But if you ask the wrong people, they want to put a price on it. And so, yeah. Go get Shotgun Love Song if you don't know it. Yeah. And Godspeed, which is Nick's latest, and an absolutely harrowing tale of what it looks like when the West falls into the wrong hands,
Well, I just, thinking about your comments about community and your work with this book, and thinking about the changing West, I just keep thinking of our hunting trips, Chris, and the relationships you formed with landowners where we go hunting, and I think about those people that I only know tangentially for showing up on their front porch with you, with a 24-pack of beer or whatever it is. And like the reverence that you pay to those people, the like true reverence and respect that you pay them, and thinking about somebody else living on those parcels of land, bums me out, thinking that that's going to change potentially. But anyway, man, I just think the world of you. I think you're a hell of a writer. I think this is your best book. I mean, like sentence by sentence, word by word, it's fucking beautiful. And that's saying something, because Body of Water is like I think, becoming something of a classic. So,
Well, thank you, man. That means the world. And you know, shit, when I started out in this whole deal, I never would have dreamed to have a friendship like the one we have, which is a literary friendship, but also a, you know, a real friendship. We're lucky, man. I'm so lucky to call you an editor and a friend, and yeah, a fellow dog owner. And you know, what's the old Wen Fu line from the Wen Fu, The Art of Writing? The pleasure a writer knows is the pleasure of sages, and you know, our friendship's part of that. So I'm a lucky, man, for sure.
I'm lucky too.
Let's go find some birds.
Let's go find some birds.
Yeah, thank you both
Right.
for giving
Thanks,
us a peek into the friendship. You all need to start writing letters to each other so that you can publish them in a book in a couple decades. Again, the book is The River You Touch. You can check out recordings at the Books in Common Northwest YouTube page. Please be sure to share this event with anybody that you think might enjoy it. Thanks again, everybody. And thank you, Chris and Nick, for joining us this evening. See you all next time.
Thanks, Lane.